Before we dig deeper into the book, as always, we like to kind of get an idea of the author, or in this case, yourself. And so I did a little bit of research before this conversation, and Wikipedia tells me that you were born in Delhi. I just assumed you were in London for some reason, and like, so that I apologize for that. And quoting a recent tweet that you put out, you mentioned you were someone born into a family-run bookshop. So before we get to know about the bookshop, I'd love just to know about you and your family history just prior to this kind of opening of the bookshop and everything that comes with it. So kind of how did your family end up where they were?
Family, all four sides, my paternal and maternal grandparents, their histories can be traced back to what is now Pakistan. My maternal side both came from Lahore, different parts of the old city of Lahore. My paternal grandfather came from Malakwal, which is in western Punjab in Pakistan. And my paternal grandmother came from the northwest frontier province, Dera Ismail Khan. And I would say that my paternal family was far more impacted by partition, the actual migration, the actual living in the camp, than my maternal family, who came a little bit early and already had family in India, so they were able to settle. They didn't witness any hardship as such. For my paternal family, and sorry to cut myself off, but that's also the reason that my maternal family talks far less about partition than my paternal family, because it really didn't impact them economically, or their foundation wasn't moved as with my paternal family. My father's parents both had very difficult migrations. They were both quite young. My grandmother was 16, my grandfather was 19. And these are really like formative years as a young adult for both those people. So my grandfather was in college, my grandmother had just finished high school or 10th grade as it was. And both their families came to Delhi by train. They both ended up in Kingsway Camp, which was the largest refugee camp in Delhi, in the north of Delhi, in the area that is now Delhi University, or commonly called North Campus. So over there, it was a very, very large camp, and it was separated into lines. And those lines they had tents, they had houses, they had barracks, and those were given to you depending on your economic situation. So for instance, my grandmother's sister was a commandant at the camp, so she got a barrack to live, which meant the family would live in a proper barrack, a proper building. My grandfather, on the other hand, lived in a tent with his family and another family initially, and then they got a bigger tent, and then they got a house. So, I think the entire mindset of living in a camp, having lost everything, to be reduced to the status of a refugee, this is something that was really imprinted in their minds. And both my grandparents tried very hard to rid themselves of this tag of the refugee. So my grandfather did go on to set up a bookshop, but before that, he did all sorts of really random things, because in those days, if you had just come to India, or if you had just come to Pakistan, you were literally trying to get any work that you can so you could put food on the table. And it was literally hand to mouth. And in the case of my grandfather, he worked on the railway station. He sold railway seats, he sold coal, he sold pens, he sold all sorts of things before he finally mustered up enough money to make like a down payment on a bookshop or a shop, really. And even for that, his mother had to sell 2 of her gold bangles. So it was really like a family endeavor. And then he ended up buying this bookshop. And he learned to be a bookseller really on the job, because he had this shop, it had shelves, the shelves were empty, he didn't know what to do. And he found his way to Connaught Place in Delhi. And in Connaught Place, he had an acquaintance who was also a refugee. And he went to him and he said, I have this shop, but I don't know what to put in it. What do I do? He was a math student in Pakistan, my grandfather. So he said that, like, I can't make a business in a shop teaching mathematics. What can I do? Help me. And this acquaintance said, well, I own a bookshop. And if you want, I can teach you to be a bookseller. This is the only thing I know. And my grandfather, who did not really have the luxury of choice at that moment, said, yeah, why not? And so what this acquaintance did was he took titles off his own shelf and he gave them to my grandfather. And he said, start with these. So every day my grandfather would get 4, 5, 6, 7 books and go from Connaught Place to Khan Market, put them on his shelf and wait for people to come. And in those days, India had just become independent. The kind of reading people wanted to do was determined by that feeling. So people wanted to read about world politics, they wanted to read about economics, they wanted to read about, I don't know, the structure of the world post World War II. And so my grandfather, this young man, would sit with a pad of paper and a pen and write down what people wanted to read. So if someone said, oh, do you have, I don't know, great expectations, for example, my grandfather would say, no, we don't have it, but I'll have it for you by tomorrow. So he would write it down. And in his lunch break, he would go to Connaught Place, pick up Great Expectations, have it on his shelf the next day for the customer, which means that your customer is actually responsible for how you curate your bookshelf, which means that there is such a collaboration between the person who's buying the books and the person who's providing the books. And this little habit of this notepad and pen has continued till date. That's it. If you go to Bahari Sons bookshop, any of the Bahari Sons in India or in Delhi, we're only in Delhi, and you ask for a book and they don't have it, they're going to write it down on a little pad of paper, and probably by the very next day, they will have the book for you. So, certain things, yeah, I mean, it's also a family business. Certain things have continued, but all this to say that my grandfather really didn't have the luxury of choice at the moment. He did whatever he could to get food on the table. And I think sometimes when he would speak about the camp, he would talk about food. Literally, he would talk about food and how they wouldn't, every day would be dal and chawal, but some days they would have a vegetable, or on the very rare days they would have a meat, or on the really big celebration they would have kheer. And I think that, I don't know, I always try to put myself in that situation and wonder how I would feel if I lost my home, if I didn't have any place to call my own, if I was in a new country trying to speak a new language, in a new profession, how lonely I may feel. And I think then about the family structure, and you mentioned that earlier in your introduction as well. It's really the things, the utensils, the food, the community, the intimacy of family that I always think about when I think back to remotes, particularly my family, of course.